for this week's example, what I essentially want you to do is create a responsive layout. Now, you've got a few options again. If you want to go ahead and start this from scratch or use your last week's example and modify that, you can. I've also provided a download link to the starting point for the example that I'll be showing if you want to follow along with that. In fact, there's pretty much the complete example just with bits of code blocks commented out, so that should be fairly easy to follow along with, but I would like sometime before next week for you to attempt or re-attempt this exercise, building it from scratch, because there is a bit that goes into the designing of how you structure your HTML code to allow it to work nicely with responsive CSS, which you won't really get so much in the example that I'm showing you here because that stuff I've already implemented. I will talk about it, I just won't necessarily go through it line by line. Okay, so what we're going to do is create a responsive design. As I said, I'm starting with a desktop-sized layout just because it's what you're familiar with, and we're going to size it down. But you can also go the other way, start mobile and size up. So just keep that in mind. So what we're going to do is apply a mostly fluid approach. Actually, I'm going to apply a bit of a mix of this and the layout shifter approach. But what we're going to do is implement fluid column grids. Now, all of this stuff, all of these approaches to making a layout responsive, you'll find these all mentioned in these articles as well, so definitely have a look at those after. So we're going to implement fluid column grids, we're going to make flexible images, we're going to make adaptive fonts, and we're going to use media queries to adjust the layout of our content blocks as the screen varies in width. Okay, so this is the starting point for the exercise. I've just made another fairly generic layout. Okay, I've just got nonsense content, so doesn't necessarily mean anything. I've tried to keep the styling fairly simple because I want to focus primarily on the various different content blocks and how we're going to lay them out. So I want to keep my CSS as minimal as possible for that. Now, I've already implemented a couple of things that we talked about in here, just because it will take a bit too long to do them manually as we go along, but I will talk about them at the very least. So let's maybe have a look first at the HTML code. So I've just created an HTML5 document, linked my style sheet. These links here are just linking to a couple of custom fonts from Google Web Fonts. I've got a wrapper div, which just contains everything and keeps it center aligned. Inside that, I've got a header with the logo and the site title. I've got the main navigation section, which at the moment is styled as a vertical menu. I have then a main content area, which encompasses from this top picture all the way down to these 4 articles here. Inside of that, that contains a feature article with title and then a section with recent articles which are displayed in 4 columns. And then the supplementary section, which is kind of like the sidebar. I've avoided actually referring to anything here as a sidebar because in my responsive layout, if I'm going to be stacking columns, it doesn't make semantic sense to call this a sidebar if it's sitting down here. So I've called this section simply supplementary. And then I've just got the standard footer down here. Okay. Now, the first thing that I implemented, and it's probably a good place to start, is by by sorting out, when you've got your style guide for your fonts, making them adaptive by applying relative units of measurement rather than fixed pixels. So you'll notice that I've already done that, and the suggested relative unit to use or adaptive unit to use for specifying font size is the EM, or alternatively the REM, which I'll mention in a second. EMs can seem kind of confusing as to what exactly they are, and for that reason a lot of people tend to avoid them. The reason that it's suggested that you use EMs for font size rather than pixels is that initially there was the problem that pixels should map to a pixel on a display. And as soon as we started getting high resolution displays, you had designers who were understandably going, okay, I want this particular heading or this particular paragraph to be a particular font size in pixels, and it looks good at that size. As soon as you increase the display resolution, double it, triple it, quadruple it, all of a sudden that same number of pixels takes up less visual space on the display. So pixels no longer then represents a visual weighting for that. What it represents is a hardware limitation. Now devices actually sort of fudge this and get around it by actually scaling them, so they go, okay, we really think you mean when you said pixels that you want it to look about this big. So they fudge that, and so that's what creates a lot of confusions, in that pixels kind of are adaptive, but only because the browsers sort of work around it. But actually the best way of defining it is to say, I want a font, regardless of what device it's on, regardless of what resolution it's on, I want it to look about the same size, regardless of how I'm viewing it. So if I'm viewing it on my computer screen at 72 dots per inch from a meter away, I want that to look about the same size as viewing it on my mobile phone from about 20 centimeters away that has a super high resolution display. And then there's mixtures of all of those things. So actually probably a better way to think of looking at the visual weight of things is not a physical size, because a physical size, to think of it as a physical size works when the displays are all the same resolution and you're always looking at them from the same distance. But you could be looking at a TV from across the room and where the pixel density is actually really low. And you want to be able to read that there as you want to be able to read it here, as you want to be able to read it on your phone. So a good way of thinking of it is actually how much of your vision that particular visual element takes up. And that's what EMs, that's what the use of EMs is attempting to do. So if you have something that's consistent EMs across devices, then it should look consistent. It should be consistently readable, regardless of whether that device's display resolution or how far away from the user it actually gets used. Now, having said that, a lot of people still like to design their font style guide based on pixels on a desktop display, and that's fine. So, and in fact, that's how I initially started to doing this. So what you will want to do is figure out how to be able to convert your pixel sizes to your EM sizes. And once you understand that, it doesn't seem so weird that you have these really specific floating point fractions for the EM sizes. So what I've done here is I originally had this set up so that I said I want my, well, I started at H1, I want my heading 1 to be 24 pixels. I wanted my heading 2 to be 18 pixels. My heading 3 to be 16 pixels. And my paragraph to be, 14, I think. So they're the original pixel sizes that I chose out for those fonts. And I went, yep, on my desktop, that looks about right. So now I want to convert them to EM, so the relative weights of those should look good on any device. And so the way that we convert these is we take the pixel value, okay, and we divide it by what's called the default context for that display. Now the default context is the default size rendering for a font on a particular device. Now for a desktop browser, unless you've specifically overridden it in the user agent style sheet, in which most cases you haven't, then the default context, the default font size for a desktop browser is 1 EM is equivalent to 16 pixels. So once you know that, it's very easy to convert from pixels to EM. All I have to do is go, okay, if I want my paragraph to be 14 pixels in EMs, I simply do a calculation of 14 divided by 16, and I get the number 0.875. So that's how I've come up with that number. All right, and then if I want my heading 1 to be 24 pixels, 1.5 EMs. 18 pixels, 1.75. Sorry, 18 pixels, 1.125 for my heading 2, and 16 pixels, obviously 16 over 16 is going to be 1 EM, and that's why my heading 3 is 1 EM. Okay, so by doing that, you will save yourself a lot of headache by not relying on the device itself to attempt to figure out what exactly you meant by 16 pixels. If you do that, it should look the equivalent visual weight across any device that understands EMs. Now, the other nice thing about using EMs is that, well, actually, before I say that, you'll notice elsewhere that I've got other units of measurements, not just the font size in EMs. And the reason that that's good is because if we take a content-centric approach to, oh no, frozen computer. No, there we go. Whew. If we take a content-centric approach to designing our layout, then this is possibly not necessarily a great example. Maybe a better example would be last week's exercise. Okay, so last week's exercise, if you have a body of text, okay, you can read up on a lot of thoroughly tested theory about what's a comfortable line width of text to read. That's why they print out novels in a certain size, and they have columns of text in a certain size. Okay, and this, whether it's characters or words, okay, it's generally and sometimes language dependent, but roughly you can say it's like 10 to 13 words per line. Okay, so there's about that many here. That's how I decided on the width of this layout. But if I change the font size, if I make it bigger, then all of a sudden there's going to be less words per line, so I'm going to have to go and make my content area bigger in order to keep it that nice, comfortable numbers of words per line. What I can do is I can actually size my content block not in pixels or percentages, but I can size it in EMs. And what that means is that if I decide just to make my content bigger, then the content block itself will size based on the size of the font and get bigger along with the font and keep that nice number of words per line. Similarly, I can size things like my margins with EM, so that if I make the font smaller, if I have a tiny little font, it doesn't necessarily make sense to have this huge margin anymore. So I can have my margin scale along with my fonts as well. So EMs are a useful unit, not necessarily just for font sizes, but for actually adapting adapting the sizes of content blocks and margins and things like that as well. So as you'll see throughout the code, I have, for example, things like margins. So I expect that if I make the fonts bigger, then I'm going to need my margins bigger and vice versa. Okay, now the other nice thing about EMs is find it. Okay, the other nice thing about EMs is that their values are inherited when you nest objects. And by that I mean if I want to change the overall font size of this whole thing, if I've set up my font values in EMs, all I have to do is set the body font to be, let's say, 0.8 EMs, and it will adjust everything else accordingly. And I've done that on part of it here. Is when I laid this out, I've already decided on my base paragraph font, which would be for a full article page, which I haven't designed up, but I wanted it at a certain size. Now these articles down here use paragraphs, but because they're sort of little snippets of information, I don't want them to have the same visual weight as a full-on page or article. So I want the font sizes there to be slightly smaller. Now if I had set my base fonts to be in pixels, I'd have to go through and specifically target those headings and those paragraphs and set them also to different font sizes. And then if I decided to globally change the fonts again, I'd have to come back and modify them again. What I can do, because I've defined them in EMs, is all I need to do is essentially get the container element that all of this stuff is contained in, which is an element called with an ID of recent, and I simply just say make the font size 0.9 EMs. Okay, and maybe I need to make it more significant so that you can actually see it. Okay, so I've made it too extreme there, but you can see the difference. So I've globally adjusted down all of the fonts within that section just by using one line of code instead of targeting them all specifically. And now again, if I made the entire body section bigger in terms of font, then that would adjust accordingly as well. So that can be useful. It can also be a pain when that's not a desired effect, because it can get confusing when you have a lot of things nested. So if you have something that has a container which has a font size of 1 EM, and then something inside that which has a font size of 0.5 EM, and then something inside that which has 0.5 EM again, then that's going to be 0.5 of 0.5 of 1. So it's going to be 0.25 of its grandparent element and not half. If that's not the intended effect that you want, then you can use this other new unit called REMs, which simply stands for root EMs. So what that does is say, make this size relative, but only based on what the very root font size is. So you set the font size once in the body or in your root elements, and then whenever you specify something in units of REMs, it's relative based on that and ignores any other nesting of the EMs. Okay, so that is fonts. This is one thing, just quickly, that testing in the browser is not a great indication of how fonts are going to render. Because these sites like, or even just, let's do the responsive design view. Because really all these do is keep your desktop, they obviously still use your desktop resolution, but they also use the default desktop context. So the size that this is going to render the fonts is not necessarily a good indication of how it's going to display on a mobile device. So the fonts is probably one thing that you definitely want to test on either a mobile simulator or a real device. Well, we'll look at that in a second. Okay, All right, so now we're on to, actually, no we're not. Sorry, I forgot to mention my fluid column. So the other thing that I've already implemented, and you can see it in effect here as I size it down, is fluid images and fluid columns. And they're both easy to implement and have existed before responsive design was even a thing. So it was a bit of a movement of just fluid layouts in general, but which has been folded into responsive design. But I'll just quickly show you that. So fluid images, first of all, is simply a matter of adding a style to your image where you tell it to have a width of 100%. Now, you could add this to specific images. I've added this globally to all images to make all images on the page responsive. And if I take this out, okay, you can see that obviously they're just going to go in at the size that I specify. And if I was doing this, I would specify a smaller size, but you can see how they're not, obviously not adapting, okay? They just fold over, or they just crop, stay the same size. Now, you could set the width to be 100%, but what that will do is if you actually go larger than the picture needs to display, the picture will size up greater than 100%. So actually what I was kind of referring to before. So usually you don't want to make an image go larger than 100% of its resolution because it starts to lose visual fidelity. So more commonly what you want to do is say, well, set the max width to be 100% of its container. So that means if there's enough space, make it its full size but no bigger, and then if there's not enough space, size down so that it fits 100% of its container element. Okay, so that's fluid images, quite easy to implement. You can as well set a min width. If, for example, I was sizing this all the way down and I didn't want an image to go small in a certain size, I could set it at a minimum width so it stops scaling down, and then perhaps I'd add some more styles to say, well, once it reaches a certain minimum size, start cropping it instead of resizing it. But I'm not going to do that because what I'm going to do is when it gets too small, I'm actually going to change the layout of the page. Okay, and fluid columns is really, again, just simply a matter of rather than specifying your div or your column widths in rigid pixels, setting them as percentages, or as I said before, you can even do it with EM, some sort of relative unit. So I have my main content section here, which is this whole right-hand section, and you can see that its width is set to 75%. Now I've got its container to be a fixed width of, or a fixed max width of 980 pixels, so that's because I just don't want it to go any higher than that. There's no reason why I couldn't take this out, in fact, and it would just keep expanding. Okay, but I know as part of my design I don't really want anything to be larger than 960 pixels of the width, so I'm leaving that in. Sorry, 980. So I could, knowing that width, actually specify the width of this content rigidly in pixels. I could say, well, let's make it, let's go, well, what's 75% of 980? Okay, so I can make it 735 pixels. Okay, and at its default display, it doesn't look any different. But what you will see is that when I size down, it's going to start folding, and then when it runs out of space, it's ultimately going to just disappear off the edge and start cropping. Okay, so it's very simply just a matter of deciding how much, and you can you can design this up in pixels and then convert that. It's simply a matter of getting the percentage of the width of its parent container. So I've got these set up to be 75% width for that one, and then 22% width for the stuff that goes on the left, and then whatever the leftover percentage is acts as a margin. So we put that back in, and then it scales down nicely. Likewise, I have my recent articles set up to be percentage widths as well, so they're each 23.5% of the parent container wide with a 2% margin. Just incidentally, I'll mention this thing here. It's a pseudo selector that you possibly may not have used before. This is a good one for getting around. All of these have a margin right style to add this here, but the last one here, I don't want it to have that margin. So I've used the pseudo selector recent article nth child 4, meaning the fourth one of those, to set the margin right to be 0. And then they fit just nice and neatly lined up there like that. Okay, but the important thing is that these are also all set to be 23.5% of the width. And so you'll notice that the way I came up with this number is I've got 4 of them times 23.5%. All right, and then I've got 1, 2, 3 bits of margin. So I have, if I know I want 2% margin, I've got 3 of them. Okay, that adds up to 6%. So then I've got 94% of space left to divide up amongst them. So I'm going to go and assume that 94 divided by 4 is 23.5%. Okay. All right, so that's a bunch of stuff that's already responsively laid out. And it kind of works to an extent when you get down to a certain amount of size, but we do reach a point where that just becomes not a very nice experience to read or look at. So probably the best approach here is once I get to a certain size, there's one or two things I can do. I either need to deal with the layout of the columns here, because they're too squished, or I need to maybe get rid of this stuff and move it somewhere else. And if I get small enough, then these menu items are going to start folding and not look very good either. So my first approach is going to be to move this vertical menu here up the top, move this supplementary section so that it sits down here, and I made a very conscious choice to sit it down there and not any higher up, because in my content hierarchy that I've decided that after the header, the most important things are the navigation, then the feature article, then these other articles, and then the supplementary I don't care so much about. So always thinking about your content. I've decided that this supplementary section, it'd be something like, I don't know, like my Twitter stream or something else. Something not hugely critical that the reader needs to see. I'm going to put it down the bottom. Okay, so to go about doing that, we need to employ our media queries. So I've got a section down here with a bunch of them commented out. Don't really have time to type them out by hand, so I'm just going to uncomment them bit by bit and explain what they're doing. So the first one I'm going to uncomment is this second one here. Bigger? How big? That big? Is that good? Okay. All right, so there's a media query here, and okay, I'll just explain the syntax here again. So it starts with @media. I may have forgot to mention, actually, I don't remember what I said last class and this class, but I'll say it again just in case. The media, the @media or the media query stuff has actually been around since CSS2. its original intention was to be able to specify, for example, a different style sheet for the display, or if you're printing it out. So a simple example of that might be, if I want to print it out, let's change the fonts to serif fonts. If I want to display it, let's change the fonts to sans serif fonts. And so you're always able to specify different style sheets. And if we look at this style sheet here, when I've linked it, this media attribute all there just means use it for everything. But you can when you're linking separate style sheets, and you could do this the other way. Yep. So are these two here? They're just links to some custom fonts using Google Web Fonts. So all you do is you link those, and then you can use a new font in your CSS. Yeah, that's right. So media here, you can link a style sheet and say, I only use this style sheet for a particular media. So ultimately, in the end, if you had a pretty big project, what I'd probably recommend is splitting up your style sheets. If you want to target different media, different devices, then you can link them differently, so that actually it just compartmentalizes your code a bit better. But I only show this to make the point that the media option has been around for a while. No one just really used it a lot because not a lot of people really care about making their websites printable. But it's an extension of this. It's an extension of this feature, and it's just added a bunch of stuff to say, well, let's just give you the ability to be a lot more specific about the way that it's presented. So I have this media, and then we have a word here which says what type of device to display it on. So this says screen. It could also say print. It could also have, you can also have things here for like brow readers and screen readers, so accessibility stuff. Okay, but generally you'll most of the time see screen there. And then anything that comes after here is to say, well, okay, it's screen and these particular conditions need to be met. So apply this if the display device is a screen, and only apply it up until the width is no more than 769 pixels. So as soon as it goes over 769 pixels, ignore this. If it's underneath that, then apply it. Now, you'll see that I haven't specified a minimum width here. A lot of the examples you'll see will specifically say, for this minimum width to this maximum width, apply this stuff. The approach I'm using here, rather than having to rewrite all these styles, what I want to actually do is go down in size, and when I apply this next one, which is 710 pixels, I want it to still apply these styles here. So each time it evaluates this, it will apply any of the media queries that evaluate to be true for that device. So if my max width is, if my width is less than 710 down here, then it's also less than 769. So if that's the case, then it's going to apply this and this. And that just enables me to retain these styles and add to them here rather than having to rewrite them all out again specifically. Okay, and the word that I skipped over here, only, this only word is written into the specification, and its only purpose is to make older browsers, user agents that don't recognize media queries ignore it. So they'll see this, they'll go media only, go, I don't know what you're talking about, media only, and they'll ignore it. So on a modern browser, this will work without that, but it's suggested that you leave it in just for backwards compatibility. Okay, so let's have a look at what I'm actually doing here. Well, let's look at the result first of all. So I've enabled this. Okay, we'll refresh that page. Now we'll size it down and let's see what happens around 769 pixels. Okay, so sizing it down, that's 780, 79. Okay, That's 770 pixels there. 769. Okay, so what I want you to pay attention to is that this says max width 769. That means including 769 pixels wide, do this stuff. Okay, so it flicks over right at 769 pixels. Okay, so we can see the layouts change there, but what have I actually done? Well, let's look at the inspect tools. All right, let's look at the code here. So first of all, I've said, okay, the main content section, which was that section on the right, which encompassed this top feature article and then these bottom supplementary articles. I said for the main content and the main nav, set their width, which was formerly 75%, set it now to 100% and get rid of any of the floating. Okay, it was 75% and floated to the right. Now make it 100% and don't float at all. So the result of that is that it takes up now the entire width available to it. Okay, so there's the nav there, and there's the main content, taking up 100% of the width. So if I just hover over the main content here and have a look again. Okay, so this is just before the breakpoint where my default styles are applied. Okay, there's my main content, width 75%, float right, overflow hidden. Okay, the overflow hidden is just to clear the floating of these elements here. But I will bring it to your attention just to show you that in the media query I haven't overridden this style, only the first two. So this third one will actually still be applied. So, okay, I'm sizing it down and there we go. Okay, so now it's saying there's my style, the media only screen and max width 769 pixels, main content, main nav, width 100%, float none. Okay, but it's still showing me that my default style that I've applied is still applying. Okay, so there's the main content style that I already declared up the top of my style sheet, and you can see these first two crossed out because I've specifically overridden them. Okay, but it's important to remember that I've got this third style here which I haven't overridden. It doesn't ignore this style. Okay, it just either overwrites or appends to that style. So that's an important thing to remember. If you think you've written some styles in a media query and it's still applying something that you don't think you've written, then have a look in here, and more likely than not, it's probably a default style that you've written already up the top that hasn't been overridden. Now, if I did want to override this overflow hidden, then I could simply add to my media query an overflow visible style, okay? And then that would update that. It's not going to visually look much different, but that's how that works. Okay, so what else have we done? Now, the supplementary section, okay, I told its width to be auto, meaning it will take up whatever space is available to it. And I've just changed the margin padding and given it a border because it now sits down here, okay, rather under the main content area rather than up on the side. I felt I needed to visually separate it a bit more from the main content, so I just added a new style and gave it the border there. So let's see, where is that there? Okay, so there it is. Okay, and again, you can see that the width attribute has been overwritten. The float left attribute hasn't. I probably could. I don't need it to float left anymore in this case, but it's not really going to make much difference. I could, if I want to come back here and override that, say float none. Okay, and if I inspect it again, there it is. Now they are both overridden. Okay, so this is not necessarily anything new. Okay, this is something which a lot of people tend to overlook, which is one of the really powerful things of CSS. It's what's called the cascading style sheet. It means you write things and you overwrite things, but they all combine down into one style sheet. So it's important to remember that styles will still be applied even if you've created a new definition of that style, as long as you haven't overwritten them. Okay, now the main navigation, I styled it to be a horizontal navigation menu instead of a vertical navigation menu. And because I've done that purely with CSS, it's been much easier to adjust that in a responsive design. If I had done that with JavaScript or something, okay, I would have had to create a completely new JavaScript file to load out that menu and reload it. But because I've purely done it with styling, then it's been reasonably trivial to, where are we here? Nav. Okay, it's been reasonably trivial to adjust the styles so that it goes from a vertical navigation menu, okay, where I essentially just displayed them as blocks and added some padding. I've kept the same background color and the same border radius and everything like that. All I've done is, in this media query, I've told them to float left, given them a bit of a margin, and then the whole thing itself told it to float to the right. Okay, now so that looks pretty good, I think, for that size. Now as we go down a little further, get rid of that. Okay, as we keep sizing down further, the next thing I'm probably going to run into is that these 4 columns here, again, will eventually start to look pretty squished. So around about here, I think I'm going to want to change this from being 4 columns, and I'm going to lay them out, instead of 4 at a time, maybe 2 at a time. So then that's the next thing I've done here on this very next media query. Okay, remembering that all of this stuff is still going to apply, okay, in this first media query. And additionally, this stuff will as well. So first of all, I've made the header smaller because it keeps alright, I need to refresh that. There we go. Okay, so between there and there, and I've got a few more tweaks to add for that later, but one of the things I will keep doing is creating breakpoints and make that font size of that header smaller so that it stays on one line. But we'll finish that up at the end. But the important thing here is I've taken my recent section, okay, and the recent articles, instead of having them width 23.5%, I've made them 46% width. I've given them a bit bigger margin. I've put some borders, because they're now stacked vertically as well as horizontally. I've put some borders on the top to separate them, and I've changed getting rid of the margin right from the 4th child to every 2nd child, because now every 2nd one is going to be on the right edge. Okay, and let's inspect that. Okay, there's the article, so I'll go, where are we? Okay, still got 4 columns, so the difference between there and there, okay, so we can see, there we go, recent article, width 23.5, even if we just look at that, we can see where that's changed, 23.5%. Size it down a little more, bam, okay. And you can see that all 3 of these default styles have been overwritten in the recent article. So I've changed the width, the margin, and actually it's still floating left. So I didn't necessarily need to do that. That doesn't matter. And then in addition, I've added the border and some padding and margin. Okay. So there we go, that's readable now again. So there they are stacked like that. So that will look nice on a smaller, like a smaller tablet device. And you can see again, because I've specified my images fluidly, when it jumps from 4 columns to 2 columns, initially there's a bit more space, so the images actually size up to their full size, but no bigger, because I set them as max width. Okay, and then eventually I'm going to get to a point where 2 columns is even too many, and down here I essentially just do the same thing, but I just have it go from, I just set the width to be 100%, so that they stack as single columns. Now, a couple of other things I've done on here, you'll notice between here and here is this overlay on the featured article. When that image gets small enough, it takes up a significant portion of it and actually kind of blocks it off. So what I've done is adjusted that layout so that it rather than overlaying that image, it shows up down here. Won't necessarily go through that in detail, but the CSS is there if you want to look at it. And the last thing that I want to do is it gets to a point where it's going to be small enough that this navigation menu here is not going to fit nicely on one line. So what I'm going to do is get rid of it there, and I'm going to put a select drop-down menu up here. So what I've done is I've moved the title from floating to the right of the logo, and I've just said, well, okay, just wrap you round on your own line, which leaves us enough space here to add a drop-down menu. Now, the drop-down menu, unavoidably, to get that working, I have to have an extra bit of the HTML. So I've got this bit commented out here just after the logo in the HTML, and it's another nav section, except it's composed not of a list, but it's a select construct with a bunch of options. So that gives us like a drop-down combo box, and I've simply duplicated all of the menu names that were on the old menu. Okay, so there it is there, and I've styled it to essentially float to the top right. Now, the other navigation menu has disappeared, but I want to show you how. So it's still there in the code, my main nav, but I've just set it to display as none. If I disable that, you can see that it's still there. You can also see how it will start wrapping around. So I've set in this media query the main nav to display none, and I've set I've included this. Now, one thing I do have to be careful of is, because I've simply just added that to the HTML code and not necessarily styled it, what you're going to see is if I go bigger now, my regular navigation appears back here, but I still have this other one here, which I don't want that. There's no need for me to duplicate that. So what I have to do is by default hide this one and only make it visible when the media query determines that it's a certain size. So the way that I do that is rather simple. I've just set a default style for this navigation, which I've given an ID of compact nav, to display none, so it'll always be there, it just won't render. And then in this media query down here, I've told the compact nav to display block and float right. So now, as soon as that media query doesn't apply, it will revert to the default style, which will tell it to just disappear, and we'll rely on those other menus. Now the only other bits that I still have commented out are merely just tweak points that I've added any time that I saw that title wrapping, just to modify the font size of that header in the image. So if I add those back in, now I can see that anytime it gets close to wrapping, it sizes down like that. Okay, and that's how we create our responsive layout. So I'll very quickly just have a look at it in one of these responsive tester sites. So let's have a look at the Responsinator. And I'll plug this in. The one disadvantage of this is you obviously have to have it up on a publicly accessible server. So I have uploaded this to my website, so I'll just punch that in there. Okay, and there we can see. So it looks good. The iPhone in the portrait mode goes to the next biggest one. It's kind of nice. Some more stuff, different size phones. And then we start to get to the tablets, the iPad. So what's interesting to see is that it will actually respond to how the width changes based on portrait and landscape mode. So you can see in portrait mode it has that second smallest layout with the horizontal menu up the top and the supplementary section down the bottom. But when you rotate it, okay, it's actually big enough to accommodate the full layout. Okay, now I did say that it is good, particularly with fonts, to have a look at what it looks like in a mobile simulator or an actual device. So I will just very quickly see what it looks like in my iOS simulator app. So let's look at let's go for the iPhone 8. Let's go to the old school iPhone. There we go. Okay, now, this is very important to remember. So I'm looking at it here and it doesn't look right. Thanks. Okay, it doesn't look right. Something is going wrong. And the reason it's doing this is we have to add one more step before we get it to work properly on the mobile device. Now, the reason for this, that it's doing this, is kind of convoluted, but it's based on the fact that when mobile browsers came out, there weren't mobile-specific sites, so most of the sites you would be browsing would be full desktop websites. So rather than zooming in and having to have you zoom out, what they did would be set the viewport to be like 800 or 1,000 pixels or something like that, and just zoom out on the web page and then let you zoom in. And by default, that's still going to happen unless you specify otherwise. Fortunately, it is very easy to specify that, and the way we do that is by adding this meta tag in here that I have commented out, which is the viewport tag in the head section of our HTML document. Okay, so what this says is meta name equals viewport, and the contents you say width equals, and then you can put a device width in there, which when there was only one iPhone, you put width equals 320 pixels. But again, it's not very foresightful, it's not very responsive. Best thing to do is put width equals device width, and then that would just set it to whatever the device is reporting that its width happens to be. Then these other two options allow you to specify whether or not you want the user to zoom in and out, and also what zoom level you want it to start at. Normally, if you want it like a full screen web app, you'll set the initial scale to be 1, and you'll set the maximum scale to be 1 as well, because there's no real need for them to be able to zoom in and out when you've already set a responsive layout for that size. So we add that back in, and again, this is not something that showed up when we were testing it in the Responsinator, right? It looked fine, so that's why it's always good to test on a simulator or an actual device. So I've added that viewport tag. Oh dear. Sorry, I'm looking at the wrong file. There we go. I've added the viewport tag there. Now, just to prove that I'm not having a go, let's take it out. Fresh. Okay, right, so that's what it looks like by default. Okay, we get it's creating a virtual viewport of like, I don't know, like 900, 1,000 pixels or something, and going, just fit it like that, and then if you want to look at something, you double click and you zoom to it. Okay, and that's a pretty good way of getting around browsing large websites in a mobile context, but we want our layout to take, so we add the meta add the meta tag back in, and refresh. Okay, and there is our nice mobile layout. Okay, and the other cool thing about using a select menu here is that you get the nice mobile context and it comes up as a nice selection menu here. So I could just go click on that one. I'd implement a little bit of JavaScript to make that navigate to a new page. You can also test the orientation, so I can see when it's in landscape mode, it has enough room for the next level up. I can change the device. Okay, and again, we see again how it nicely adapts to whatever the device is. Okay, and so again, what I want to reiterate is I didn't attack this with a specific set of devices in mind. I looked at the content. Okay, by eye, I figured out when it started to not look good. I said, okay, we'll break it there, there, and there. Generally, if you do that, it's going to look good on these devices at those widths anyway. Okay, so that is pretty much everything for today. As I said, there's a lot of extra information. If you're only going to read one article, read this top one. There's also a very good Linda video called Responsive Design Fundamentals, I think, which is about 2 hours long, which again really nicely covers the broader context of responsive design, some of the theory behind it. Also, if you can look up responsive images, there's a really kind of emerging field at the moment. It's a bit complex. We didn't have time to go into it today, but it's something that's definitely going to be a thing in the future, particularly with different display resolutions, swapping in and out different resolution images. And yeah, if you can attempt that exercise, responsive layout with some media queries, and do that from scratch and get that done by next week, I'll be very happy with your progress. I'll post the completed examples and screencast later this week. Any questions? No? All good? All right. Thank you then. I'll see you next week.